We're very excited to have the history twins here with us, Carla Hall and Jim Keyes, also known as Carla Keyes.
So when most people think about the institution of slavery, they often think of the South. They think of cotton fields, they think of tobacco fields, when actually slavery was legal in all 13 colonies, England and Canada. And it was definitely legal here in New York State till about 1827?
1827.
1827. And another thing that people don't know is that the largest number of slaves was actually concentrated in New York City. Well, except second to Charleston, South Carolina. So people don't really realize until we tell them. So here we're at Raynham Hall and the grounds, and the story we're going to tell today is the story of Liss, who was an enslaved person there in Raynham Hall, with the Townsend family, along with I guess thereabouts between 12 and 19 other enslaved people at one time or the other. The Townsend family had enslaved several people at that time. Now, the thing about Robert Townsend that I believe most of you may have heard was that he is believed to have been in George Washington's, his Culper spy ring. Is this news to anyone? Yes. So it's very exciting to know that this was the home of someone who may have been a spy for the American side, for the Patriots. Now, another story that we have discovered through the work of Claire Bellergeau and the research that she did was that Liss may have been voluntold, we're not sure, to be a slave working for the American side, for the colonies. And if you think about it, it makes perfect sense that an enslaved person, especially a servant, a woman working in the home, it would be the perfect cover, because people talk all the time and they don't necessarily think about someone who would be, cleaning, emptying the chamber pots, doing those kinds of things. So she basically had the perfect cover. So after the war was over, Liss had the misfortune, so we understand, to have been sold to the South, to South Carolina. And so our talk today, our presentation, is an imagined conversation in 1789. Because one of the things that also happened with Robert Townsend is he became an abolitionist. That is someone who was against the institution of slavery. And he was one of the founders of the Manumission Society of New York. So he and his friends, his colleagues, they were working very hard to end slavery. So at this time, there had been, he had worked to strategize, I suppose you'd say, after he found out that Liss had been sold down south, to bring her back to Oyster Bay, to bring her back home. And so this is the imagined conversation of what happened when they finally came back together. So this is our story. Liss, slave, servant, spy.
Liss, thank you.
I can hear you.
You can hear? I can hear.
Not now. Well, project.
I will project.
There you go.
Thank you. Liss, I invited you here today because I want to discuss with you how to get your freedom. Now, everything that I have bought and sold is in this ledger. But you are not, because we did not purchase you. You were born here through your mother Pender, therefore you are enslaved here. In order to free you, we need a bill of sale. New York State requires it, and we don't have that.
Well, you will help me if I'm not in there. Look.
I give you my word, we will find a way.
All right. Well, it's been a long time since I've been here, and it feels very strange.
It's been 8 years.
8 years. It feels like a lifetime ago.
A war can do that.
I remember the last time that I was here in this home. I was helping your sisters, Phoebe and Sally. I would fix their hair and their dresses, straighten their room, mend their clothes, get them ready for the parties with their lovely clothing.
But then the war came, and with it came the soldiers. We had to put up the soldiers in the town of Oyster Bay, and the officers chose our home as their headquarters. And of course, we were patriots, so we had to keep this quiet. It seemed that all of Oyster Bay were loyalists who wanted to stay loyal to King George and not get our independence.
Yes, and they were here in your home along with your family and the rest of us, which doubled my work. In addition to helping your sisters, I also had to, there was sweeping and the scrubbing of the floors. There was emptying the chamber pots. Just so much work for a home this size.
It's true. And then came the Queen's Rangers.
Yes. Although when the Queen's Rangers were here, there was much less vandalism and crime when they were here.
They cut down my orchard.
Well, that's true, but Colonel John Simcoe, he was a good man. I mean, I understand what you say about the trees, but he spoke to me like a human, not a slave.
Well, he was an abolitionist. I'll give him that.
Well, he said that many times.
I know you were fond of him.
Well, I would imagine that you all thought he was, well, that I was a little fond of him, but I felt that he understood what it was like. And, well, his desire to help fit right into our plan to help me escape.
And how did you escape?
Well, Colonel Simcoe built a chest, and he put it in one of the wagons that the Queen's Rangers had. So I hid in that wagon all the way to New York City. It was a very bumpy ride.
Is that what he wanted those nails and hinges for?
Yes, he bought those hinges and nails from you. But when I arrived, Colonel Simcoe presented me to his British officer to be his slave in his apartment in New York City.
But that played right into our hands.
Yes, it did. When I would run on my errands, I would find your store in Hanover Square, and I would tell you the things that I overheard in that officer's apartment.
And then, from there, I would write with Liss what you told me in invisible ink, which I would then put into a sheaf of blank paper and hand that to a courier, which would go to another courier, and so on, until it reached General Washington.
Invisible ink.
Yeah, invisible ink. It was a two-part process. The first part was called the stain, in which you would write on paper, but the ink would not show up. It took some getting used to write without being able to see. And then the person that received the letter had what was called the wash, and they would paint over the letter, and that ink would be activated and would appear. Sometimes we would even write in between the lines of an everyday letter, so it would just appear to be an everyday letter and not have information. But even with the invisible ink, we still wrote in code.
Code? What kind of code?
Well, General Washington and some other spies had the same dictionary. And inside this dictionary, they coded 700 words with different numbers. Your number was 355.
355.
Which means lady.
Lady. Oh, but, well, that's very clever.
Yes.
Was that also very dangerous?
It was very dangerous. The punishment if you were caught spying by the British was death by hanging.
Oh.
At one point it got so dangerous that I would not put what I heard, what you told me, into writing. Even with invisible ink and code, I would simply tell my contact what I'd heard, and that would be passed on and passed on. But in the end, we won, we survived, and I'm very glad.
And then we won the war.
That's what I said.
Well, but after the Americans, the Patriots, won the war, the British officer that I worked with that I served. He asked me to come back with him to Canada, but I didn't want to go, which is why I asked you to buy me back.
I bought you back not to be my slave. I bought you back so you wouldn't have to go to Canada if you didn't want to.
Well, everything that happened after that was really never the same.
And I'm sorry for what happened after that.
You sold me to Anne Sharwin. I was to be her lady's maid. She was kind enough, but she remarried. And after she remarried, I became her husband's property. And he wasn't very kind, and he sold me back into slavery in South Carolina.
I didn't know. I didn't know for 2 years. I made Anne Sharwin promise me that if she was to sell you, she would come to me first. I had no idea. When I found out that you had been sold and sent south, I found that husband. And I pressed him until I found out where you were. And then I contacted everyone I knew in South Carolina to arrange for you to be bought and sent back to New York.
I don't know about all of that, but I am grateful to be back here.
We had to smuggle you in. At this point, it was illegal in New York to transport a slave across state lines. And herein lies our problem. I don't have a bill of sale for you, and we smuggled you in, which is illegal. So the question remains, how do we free you?
But you will be able to, won't you?
I have an idea. You no longer are going by the name Liss.
No. Liss, that was my childhood name. I'm a woman. I am Elizabeth now.
In none of my papers, in none of my ledgers, in none of my books, do I have the name Elizabeth written.
Well, in the Oyster Bay Baptist Church, I'm listed as Elizabeth in the membership rolls. They don't know me as Liss either.
So perhaps we can work with that. That you would be Elizabeth, a free black woman. It's been 8 years. You've grown up. You've had a child. Does anyone recognize you?
I'm so much different now, but I am Elizabeth.
Well, I will keep this secret. Same as we kept secrets during the war.
Some secrets are for the best. And we're also available for questions, because we did do some research too. So if anyone has any questions, we'd be happy to answer any.
How did you spend the rest of your life once you were free?
Oh, that's a very good question. So she ended up becoming a servant in another household on Long Island. And they don't really have a lot of information on the in-between. So it's believed that she died at a particular year, but it became very hazy after she returned. They had more information on her son. Let's back it up a little bit. So when she had been sold to South Carolina, her son had been left behind. Like they kept him. And so Anne Sharwin's husband was still holding on to the son somehow. And then Robert Townsend, he came and basically interrogated the husband and took the son, bodily removed him and brought him back to Oyster Bay. So they found him employed at some point, and you don't have a lot of information for his rest of his life, but I feel in some ways we know a little bit more about what happened to her son Harry than to what happened to Liss herself. Yeah. Unfortunately, we don't always have a lot of primary documents available.
Yes.
Oh.
So I am wondering, what are the qualities, you talked about the kind of work you did. Why do you think being an enslaved person in the home would make you a good spy? And for both of you, why or how were you able to possibly be a part of the spy network?
Oh, sure. Well, I like to think that people just they kind of take you for granted. You know, you're there all the time, because I think also people don't, like, for example, we had asked you earlier, like, there might have been, say, 12 enslaved people with the family at any given time. That's a lot of people. So that means people are all around the house. They have eyes, they can see, they can hear. So if we were talking about Liss going to New York City, but let's say if it was the other way around, you'd have all of these eyes and ears that can hear all the different things that are going on. We have a story with like George Washington had a runaway slave, and when he was going back for her, he had sent a nephew, and the nephew had gone to someone else's house, and he was making a plan to take her back, but he didn't know, the nephew didn't know that all of these plans he was making was overheard by one of the servants, and at that point they were no longer slaves, they were paid servants. So I like to think that this person was like, well, I'm not going to let that person have to go back into slavery. So they sent word back to the slave who had run away, and then she was gone when he went to return for her. So they have eyes and ears, and they have brains, you know.
And again, New York City had more enslaved people than any other city except Charleston, South Carolina. So slaves were ubiquitous. They were everywhere.
You don't think about it, but they were everywhere. So, you know, people talk. There's all kind of gossip, and you hear about what's going on from house to house, and it's just a whole network that I think people took for granted and didn't even, realize existed. So if enslaved people wanted to get a message across, even without, even just for their own benefit, it would be very easy for them to do. They'd have their own codes and special ways of getting that message across.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes.
So we always think of the slave trade center is in the South, but were ships coming directly to Long Island?
No, I think there was like a path, right?
There was a path.
There was let's see, it was London to Africa, Jamaica, Africa, then Jamaica to the Caribbean. Then they would make their way to the South, and then, for example, in the people that came to Phillipsburg, Phillips Manor Hall. They were
not Phillips Manor. You're right. Phillipsburg and Sleepy Hollow. Phillipsburg Manor and Sleepy Hollow had 36 enslaved people. They were dropped off with Long Island Sound in Mamaroneck and walked all the way from Mamaroneck to Sleepy Hollow.
And one reason why they were even there is because some of them were ill during one part of the trip, so they couldn't leave the boat.
They weren't sold.
They weren't
fit enough to be sold.
Right, they weren't fit enough to be sold. So then, when the boat came back around to New York, that's where they disembarked. Disembarked. There you go. Yeah.
Yes.
You mentioned the slaves when everything was over, they became paid.
Mm-hmm.
Were they considered slaves or were they just
In 1827, slavery became illegal in New York. And it wasn't like an immediate cutoff. So there's there were a number of loopholes. You had to be of a certain age in order to be
Yeah.
you had to be a certain age in order to be freed, and they kept moving that goalpost back. The story that Carla was talking about with Ona Judge, George Washington's runaway slave, that was in New Hampshire. And New Hampshire was an early abolitionist state.
Live free or die.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
It goes all the way back.
Yeah. Yeah, so that was actually ended up being a safe place for her. And then when George Washington's nephew found out that she was there, he was still going to try to take her back. But it was New Hampshire. So I like to think that New Hampshire already had sort of a culture of, we want to be free. So, yeah, so you were saying. You were saying about the goalpost? Oh, okay, but also the goalpost, it was like if you were, it was like in 1827, if you were 25 if you were male or something like that, and then they changed it to no 28. So they kept changing the date, but at some point there was manumission, there was freedom for enslaved people.
Another New York family, the Dykmans, who have Boscobel up in. This thing's driving me crazy. There was an enslaved woman named Syl who was given her freedom, but she stayed with the family, I guess as a paid servant. They didn't specify whether or not. And this was pretty not too uncommon for someone who lived with a family for so many years to, well, where else would I go? What else do I know? What else would I do?
And in that sense, when you think about someone who might have been with the family since you were a child, and so when they have that opportunity to be free, and what does that mean, and where do I go? Well, I already know these people. It's almost like the devil you know, kind of like, well, I know these people. I know what I can expect, so I will stay here. And that is a very practical answer as well.
And
but
of course, others moved on.
Other people moved on, but I think, but also to be fair, also that same story we're talking about, the woman Syl in Boscobel in Garrison, New York. Garrison. We have letters that we feel that there's proof that they did treat her well. They did when the husband went to England and sent fabrics back for his wife. He also sent fabric for his enslaved person to also make sure she had clothes for like a dress and a cloak. So we had proof that, and there's no monolithic way to be, a slave or an enslaver. But at least when we find records like this or letters that say that we can at least feel that, okay, this person, they were at least thought of as a person. Oh, same thing with someone's in trouble.
I was right here. I didn't do it. You all saw. I'm sitting here.
But that same idea, when the wife, her children, like one of her children had died, like her son had died, daughter had died, and she wrote a letter to her husband who was overseas, and she said that Syl is like she's like a mother to me. So when we are able to get primary documents like letters, and we are able to see, oh, okay, there is a relationship, and it's very complicated. This is someone who is enslaved to you, but you're also living together. You're sharing resources. You're living under the same roof. So it's a very complicated relationship, and who can say? Because we don't have a lot of records from the enslaved people themselves.
And many of them raised their children.
Absolutely. Wet nurses as well, yes.
They thought of it much worse.
Yeah, so you would have that maternal feeling. So how can you, we can't really demonize everyone just across the board, because again, when you have those kind of familiar relationships, anything is possible. And one of the other things, one of the differences from the North and the South, and we were learning this from Lavada, who works up north, upstate, is that the thing about New York, it wasn't illegal for black people to learn how to read. Whether or not they read, we don't know, but there was no law against it. But in the South, there were laws.
Right.
So, we don't know whether or not, Liss could read. We have no proof, but we have no proof either way. But when we have stories like Jupiter Hammond, we know that he was not only articulate and a writer, he did things for his boss. Like he did
business work.
He did business work for him. So that something like that would never be possible. Well, I can't say never, but it was definitely not heard of down south. So it's good to know that at least if they possibly could learn how to read, they could. So yeah. All right, but then we also heard stories of slaves who ran away who were able to forge their own documents.
That's true. We were, yeah.
There is that too, so yeah.
All right, and thank you, Carla and Jen. We'll see you again, let's see, at 2:30.
2:30.
And